Dr. Mark Gray, was brought here today because we all have a real interest in education, and this is something that in our community he'll talk a little bit about. We have such a diverse population that I think this was something that drew a lot of interest. Dr. Gray has come and spoken to our board here before as well. Very knowledgeable. So I want to give you a little background on him. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Northern Iowa, director of the Iowa Center for Immigrant Leadership and Integration. He's the associate director of the Iowa Center on Health Disparities. He holds a PhD in applied anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder and has several published works pertaining to the subject of immigration in the Midwest. He works with diverse cultures and has worked with them continually over the years, guides managers and supervisors of diverse populations, and co-wrote Postville USA, Surviving Diversity in Small Town America. And he wrote that with Dr. Michelle Devlin. So please, without further ado, help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Gray.
Thank you, April. Everybody hear me okay with this? Thank you, April. Thanks to Craig for videoing this. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I do an awful lot of public speaking around the state, the country, even internationally, on some of the topics we'll be discussing today. But I'm always particularly happy to come to Marshalltown because I've been working in this town for almost 25 years. Ever since, as we'll talk later about the big Latino boom, this is really one of the key locations that I focused in on when that boom really started, and actually have done a lot of publishing about this community, and I'm always very happy to come back and serve. It's been my honor to serve the good people of Iowa for going on my 26th year as a professor at the University of Northern Iowa. If you attended the University of Northern Iowa, or more importantly, you have sent your children to the University of Northern Iowa, you don't have to take the quiz today. So suddenly everybody is But no, it's I really love UNI. My own children, my own daughter's going to UNI, and so I think when I start bleeding, I'll probably bleed purple. So, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some major demographic shifts in Iowa. A lot of this is going to be familiar to you because you live and work in this community. Some of the things that I'll be sharing with you are going to hit very close to home. I'm going to share with you trends across the state, okay, about a couple of major developments. And as we go through this, I want you to feel free at any time to have questions. If you want to comment, if you have an observation, if you want to pick a fight, go right ahead. April's paying me 7 figures to be here. She doesn't know that yet. Or maybe all of them are going to be zeros. I don't know. But no, seriously, I want this to be a conversation as much as possible. I want this to be useful to you and helpful to you because I do this for a living. I hear myself do this quite often. So I want you to ask me lots of questions and don't be shy at all. So do we have media here?
Right here, sir.
Where are you from, bud?
Times Republican, the local paper.
Thank you. Well familiar with it. The TR. Good. Okay, great. All right. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about 2 major demographic shifts. Again, the first one's going to be, both of them are actually going to be quite familiar to you. I want to share with you some of the dynamics of what we call the big Latino boom, which started about 1993, ended about 2008 for reasons that I'll share with you. And then we're going to talk about the most recent phenomenon that really keeps me busy these days. It's what we call microplurality, or kind of like a super diversity. The growing presence of many smaller ethnically and linguistically distinct populations. Again, you're experiencing that here as well. Ask yourself a very basic question: how did we go from 3 or 4 languages in the high school to 54 in a matter of about 4 or 5 years? And I'll be sharing some of the dynamics of that as well. By the way, Des Moines Public Schools, I used to use the figure they stopped counting at 100. They're still, and I was told I was already behind. It's actually closer now to about 110, 115. And we'll talk about some of the dynamics of that. So what you experience in Marshalltown, and what we experience in roughly 20 other communities in Iowa, the big Latino boom, try to put it in historic perspective. That is, Mexican, now remember the Latino boom in the state was predominantly, not exclusively, Mexican. And most of the folks that came to Marshalltown in the 1990s actually came from the same village in Michoacan. It's called Villachuato. I've been there several times. Some folks from the community have been here several times as well. has been there. But put it within context, and that is Mexican migration to the upper Midwest is actually relatively recent. You can see that starting about 1900 right up to about 1980, there are very, very few Mexican immigrants coming to the upper Midwest, very few. See that little bump there between the 20s and the 1930s or so? That's an interesting little side history to the state of Iowa in the upper Midwest. We brought in a number of Mexican workers to work on the railroads back then, and we actually had little barrios set up all over the state. Now, Marshalltown had one, and they literally lived on the tracks. You know that old saying, cross the tracks, they live on the tracks. We had these little barrios all over the state, even in places like Marshalltown, Mason City, Fort Dodge, Tomah. Most of those faded away within a generation or so, but those were all folks who brought in to work on the railroads. If you're interested in that kind of side history, there's a wonderful book called Barrios Norteños, or Barrios of the North. The two or three that kind of sort of lasted are in Des Moines, Muscatine. There's some people say that the one in Sioux City kind of survived as well, but most of them kind of faded away through time. A lack of new folks, intermarriage with non-Latinos and so forth. So that explains that little bump there. But you see this big turn here in the 1990s. That's exactly what we experienced here in Iowa. The Latino boom in Iowa really did start about 1992, 93, somewhere in there. I want you to look at this chart very carefully because this is just based on census data. Later we'll talk about some of the shortcomings of census data. But if you look back at the 1970 census, way back then, we only had about 17,000 Hispanics in the entire state. That's it. And by the 1980 census, we had about 23,000. It only grown by what, 5 or 6,000. That's it in a decade. And actually, when I came to UNI in 1990, there were still fewer than 32,000. When I came here, basically, Hispanics were a non-issue. They were concentrated in just a handful of communities, the Quad Cities, Muscatine, Des Moines, Sioux City, handful of other places. But for the most part, Hispanics were a non-issue in this state. There were very few of them. They tended to be concentrated in that handful of communities. But things change very quickly. And again, if you're from Marshalltown, you experience this. Some communities that started a little bit earlier, some communities that started a little bit later. But you remember, if you think back to the census, Marshall County in the 1990 census had fewer than 300 Hispanics, period, the entire county. You just had a handful of Hispanic or Latino families in the county. But by about 1996, 97, 98, somewhere in there, you had somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. It's a good faith estimate. Again, most of them came from Michoacan. And then we saw the same thing in other counties and other communities around the state. We had several counties where the Latino population grew in excess of 1,000%. A couple of counties in excess of 1,500%. Storm Lake in the 1990 census had 3 Hispanics, 3. And by 96, 97, 98, somewhere in there, they had about 5,000. Most of them, by the way, came from the same village in Jalisco. So we saw tremendous growth. And again, if you lived here at this time, you saw this. It started out as a trickle, and then it really took off as a boom. What made it take off, of course, was growing demand for Latino labor, principally in the meatpacking industry, but other value-added agriculture industries. Through time, of course, those folks have fused out into other sectors of the economy, but that's principally what drove this. And people say, well, what really spurred on this tremendous growth rate? I mean, that labor is one thing, sure, but what led to this tremendous boom? And the bottom line is that the first Mexican immigrants who came to Marshalltown in the 1990s came as what we call secondary migrants. In other words, they lived someplace else in the United States and then they chose to secondarily migrate here. So the first guy that I met from Villachuato actually migrated here from LA, Los Angeles. And then some of his friends and other folks, they kind of secondarily migrated from places like Chicago, maybe upstate New York, a handful of other places, mostly from California, but a handful of other places like Arizona. But when that was just a trickle. It became a boom when Mexicans started leaving places like Jalisco and Michoacan, and their intended destination was Iowa. So Iowa became what we call a new gateway state. That is, their intended destination, their intended first and only destination in the United States of America was Iowa. So it's a new gateway state, and as such, that's when our numbers really went right through the roof. In other words, they were not pass and go. They were not, collecting their $200. They were going straight here. They were not going to Chicago first or California or Arizona. When they crossed the border, their intention was to come to Marshalltown or Storm Lake or Ottumwa. And that's when our numbers really took off. So actually, some of the publishing that I did in the last 10, 15 years is about how Iowa became a new gateway state. Places like Marshalltown. There are a lot of people in the country who are still trying to come to terms with the fact that we have so many Hispanics. I mean, a lot of people, as you know, people on the coast like to stereotype Iowa. And I still bump into people 20 years later who just say, there are Hispanics in Iowa? Yeah, there are a lot of Hispanics. Yes, sir?
Why those two particular locations in Mexico?
That's a great question. The first handful of folks who secondarily migrated from here were originally from that village. And is what we call chain migration. The word gets out. And then it just starts to build on itself. And your brother goes, and then, your brother comes, and your sister comes, and then your sister's husband comes. And that's what it boils down to. We had a de facto pipeline. And I say de facto. It was unofficial. I actually did some publishing about how Marshalltown and Villachuata were unofficial sister cities. Marshalltown has official sister cities. As you know, I think there's one in Japan and another place I've forgotten. But so Villachuata in some ways was kind of like an unofficial sister city. And when I took leadership, including Mayor Hartoon, Chief Walker, and a whole bunch of other folks from Marshalltown down to Villachuata, they were meeting their counterparts there and realizing half the time they lived here anyway. That's the way it worked. It's just, you had people coming back and forth quite often. But that's the simple answer, yes.
More than a majority of them came from those two locations?
Well, in Marshalltown, again, I'm talking in general terms, the vast majority of that initial wave came from Michoacan. Most of them came from Villachuata. But I want to make it clear, this is an extraordinarily diverse population. As time went on, it got very, very diverse. Different locations in Mexico. And you start to see some folks come in from Central America as well. Is that a question? Yes, sir.
I understood that the packing plants put big signs that have handouts down there.
I've heard those rumors too.
They said guaranteed jobs. Well, I don't know.
Yeah. It depends. I've asked that. I have personally not seen that. But I got there after the big wave. I got to Michoacan. I did a lot of work in Michoacan, Jalisco after the big wave. I've heard that. I cannot confirm or deny that rumor, sir. Especially when the media's here and yeah. Oh, Columbus Junction. That's very possible. Yeah. But I can't confirm or deny that. I've heard that from several sources. And I'm not trying to put you off. I really don't know. The other thing that happened is important. So many Mexicans were coming to Iowa and the upper Midwest that there became dedicated, privately owned bus services. You see them come through town. A lot of those. I didn't bring the pictures, but those bus stations, where they would list the destinations. The one near Villachuata had Marshalltown. Des Moines, Iowa was spelled I-A-W-A, Iowa. So all that's actually true, but in terms of those advertisements, I don't have any firsthand knowledge of those. So as you look at this, we actually had one of the fastest growing Latino populations in the entire country. If you look at strictly at the census data between 1990 and 2000, we actually were ranked 11th in the country in terms of the percentage growth of our Latino population. And so this really did catch the attention of a lot of policymakers and others. So I was spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C. at this time talking about the boom and how to best serve those folks and so forth. Now as you see that line goes up there, those are projections. I'm going to show you another projection here in just a minute, and I'm already going to tell you that ain't true. That ain't going to happen. So the Latino boom into Iowa, I'm going to go back here. Again, based on projections and based on data and assumptions that are already a bit old, as you can see, based on these assumptions, the Latino population in the state is currently projected to go up to about 273,000 by the year 2030. But that ain't going to happen. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because why did the boom last about 15 years? And again, if you've been living in this town, you know that suddenly the growth really came to a screeching halt. That's because new arrivals of Mexican immigrants to Iowa and the United States not only stopped, but they're now in reverse. And in fact, we've lost 1 million Mexicans back to Mexico in the last 5 to 6 years. So we've actually, some cases, into Iowa, the new arrivals of Mexican immigrants to the state dropped dramatically, about 2008, 2009. But this happened in the entire country. And what you see is this reversal. So again, despite all the political rhetoric out there about illegal immigration, building walls and all that stuff, Mexicans are going home. Now, a lot of them that stay here, of course, they're integrated, their children are, in places like Marshalltown, Latinos are old news. Been there, done that. Your kids grew up with their kids. Most of their kids are English dominant. They may be bilingual, but they're somewhere along a spectrum. I spent a lot of time with these kids, and if they grew up here, they're English dominant. They're more American than my kids. Latinos are old news. It's not the big deal that it used to be because they have been your neighbors for 20 years. But the new arrivals of folks really dropped off dramatically, 2008, 2009. And ever since then, as you can see in this graph, this is for the country, by the way, we've actually lost 1 million folks that have gone home. There are a lot of indications that that's going to continue. A couple of things happened in 2008, 2009. So one of them was the Postville raid, immigration raid. That really changed a lot of hiring practices in the meatpacking industry. We also, that's the time of the Great Recession. So a lot of the jobs that used to attract legal and illegal immigrants from Mexico dried up. We knew that things were going to, we knew that new immigrant arrivals to the United States and Iowa were going to drop like a rock because the best indicators always look at new housing starts in Southern California because you know where that labor comes from. And if that dries up, there are no jobs, those people start heading home. That's part of it. Part of it too is back in the days, in the 90s, early part of the last decade, the coyote business, the smuggling business was personal. That's all fallen into the hands of the drug cartel, extremely expensive and dangerous. And plus, let's just be frank here, back in the day, and if you've been to rural Michoacan, you've been to rural Jalisco, this was a no-brainer. The rewards are here, the risks were down here. And you would have done the same thing. If, given the same circumstances, the same context for your life, the risks were here, the rewards were here, you would have done the same thing. How many young men would not come here and not speak a word of English, never finish school, and they can make $13 an hour? And those guys, if they were single, they were double shifting, sending a lot of money home, and they just bought the pickup of their dreams. And you saw them. You would have done the same thing. So all of those factors combined, and the economic conditions in Mexico have gotten better. For the most part, again, that doesn't mean that legal and illegal immigration from Mexico has stopped. It isn't, but there has been a major reversal, and we felt that here in Iowa as well. So the Latino boom, like I said, the really big boom was concentrated in the 20, 25 communities or so. Most of them associated with meatpacking, not always, but places like Marshalltown, Ottumwa, and so forth. But I want you to look at these two maps. Look at the one on the left first. This is looking at census data between 2000 and 2010. And you look on the map on the left, that shows you the relative growth in the Latino or Hispanic population in that 10-year period of time. So I want you to notice a couple of things. Almost every county, even some sparsely populated rural counties, gained Hispanic population in this time. All of them. Even some pretty darn small, sparsely populated rural counties in the state gained Hispanic population. You can see Des Moines, you can see Marshalltown there, sis, yes? Just to the northeast of Des Moines, that you got a bubble about that big, right? And you can see Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, that's Ottumwa, Muscatine, Quad Cities. You can kind of, if you're from another county, you can pick it out. There's Sioux City up in the northwest, and then if you look 2 counties above, north of Sioux City, that's Sioux County, that's Sioux Center, okay? Which has actually I've been spending a lot of time in Sioux Center the last 10, 15 years. And I want you to notice that almost every rural county actually gained Hispanic population in this 10-year period. But I want you to notice where the real big growth was. The real big growth was in the cities. So we felt it in places like Marshalltown because, you know, for all intents and purposes, your Hispanic population was minuscule. It was tiny. And then suddenly you've got several thousand of these folks. You know, you felt it, you saw it, you lived it. The schools changed, the community changed. But the real big growth, in terms of the serious numbers of growth, has actually been in the cities and suburbs, mostly in the cities. Chicago, millions of Mexicans and other Latinos live there now. It's been absolutely fascinating. Des Moines, there are neighborhoods and parts of Des Moines that are predominantly Hispanic, not exclusively, but predominantly Hispanic, and that all happened again in about that 10 or 15 year period of time. Real big growth. Look at if you haven't been to Omaha lately, go to the south side. It's Mexico, basically. Parts of Council Bluffs, Sioux City. I mean, it's just phenomenal what's happened. Major growth in Oklahoma. I spent a lot of time in Oklahoma back a few years ago because they were experiencing tremendous growth, even places like Mexico City and Tulsa. So really big growth in the city. I mean, look at the Twin Cities. I mean, it's just tremendous. But again, as time has gone on, we've seen some other major shifts. The map on the right shows the relative gain or loss of white population. Same time period, 2000 to 2010. I want you to notice a couple things. Almost all of the rural counties have lost white population. I'll talk a little more about that in just a minute. I also want you to look at where the real gains are in white population. So a couple things about this. Please keep in mind that we have 99 counties in the state. Roughly 35 of them achieved their peak population in 1990. Right after that initial wave of immigrant settlers, maybe the second generation, high fertility rates, family farms were still family farms. So you actually, about a third of our counties, that's when they achieved their peak population. Another third achieved their peak population by 1950. So what I just told you, that 2/3 of our counties achieved their peak population 65 years ago or more, 115 years ago. So rural depopulation has just been a fact of life in Iowa for quite some time. A lot of people think that it was because of the farm crisis in the 80s. No, but that accelerated it. It had been ongoing anyway, but that did accelerate in certain communities. But the other thing I want you to notice here, please, is not only do we have rural depopulation, but look where everybody's moving. You know, through time, even though in its heart and soul, rural Iowa culture is in the heart, you know, it's in small towns. We think about Iowa culture, it's still based in its heart and soul in small towns. But what's happening through time is fewer Iowans live in small towns, more live in the cities and suburbs. We call this urbanization. It's been ongoing in human history for thousands of years, and it's been ongoing in Iowa for at least 100. Yes, ma'am?
Mark, I noticed out in from central to northern Minnesota, you just got a bunch of small towns there other than Duluth and maybe Grand Rapids. What's going on in Minnesota?
That's an excellent question. Some of that, I don't know about all of them. Some of it's tourism, maybe. Retirement, people actually want to retire in the snow. That's one of my guesses. Yeah, I noticed that too. That's quite interesting. So you're going to have outliers like that. I mean, look at Iowa, you know, but you just have a handful in the rural areas that actually gained that population in that period of time. But I want to make this very clear. The gravity is in cities and suburbs, really in suburbs. Yes, sir.
The ones that aren't super urban areas in Iowa or Minnesota, all those have packing plants. I think you can spot each one of those.
Yeah.
Circles about like that. Those
Yeah.
are packing plants.
Yeah, especially on this map. Yeah, absolutely. Some of the exceptions would still be value-added agriculture, hog confinements, egg packing, that sort of thing. Yeah. So what we're seeing is, again, I did not just say there are more Hispanics than white people in these counties. I didn't say that, but these are shifts that take place through time. Okay? And urbanization, I tell my students at UNI, well, let me back up. 25 years ago, I would say, who's from a small town? And, 90% of the hands went up. And now I ask, it's maybe half, because I have more kids from Johnston now than, small town Iowa. And that urbanization is inevitable. That's where the gravity is. You have smaller market communities like Marshalltown are going to be fine. But, I'm going to be direct with you, and all due respect, we're going to have counties. We already have some counties in Iowa where the median age is 50. And some of these communities will not be there in a generation or two, all due respect. But the gravity is towards the cities. I tell my students at UNI, statistically, if they're from a small town, they're not going home. They're going to live. You know, why is West Des Moines one of the fastest growing communities in the entire country? So that's just what's happening. So keep that in mind. Another hallmark of the Latino population, it's a lot younger than the rest of us. This is really good news for school systems. It's been great news here. I mean, Marshalltown had a relatively diversified economy, but immigrants have saved our bacon in more than one way across the state. You know, 2/3 of our total population growth in the state's actually been due to immigration. And when we didn't have immigrants, we would have been in very serious trouble. And a couple of things to notice. You learned how to read these in college, of course. You see at the top, the one on the left is the Hispanic population. Relatively few elderly Hispanics, but lots of kids. But I want to point out something right now that if I had more recent data, that bottom is already coming in. Excuse me. And the principal reason that bottom is coming is because Hispanic fertility rates have dropped like a rock. They've dropped tremendously. They have dropped by less than half of what they used to be. And so actually Hispanic fertility rates right now are almost as low as they are for African American and white women. And those are pretty low too. It's not that the country will be half Hispanic, but that all the non-white people added up will outnumber the white people. And we have an awkward phrase for this, majority minority. I call it the Anglo inversion. But that's an excellent question because I'm going to share with you some other projections here in just a minute. I'm going to tell you to be very cautious, okay? About when you look at any kind of population projection, you got to be very cautious. We are heading towards at least 50%, probably 51, 52% in the next 2 to 3 decades. That's going to happen. But again, I'm always very cautious about population projections for reasons I'll share here in just a minute. So hang on there just a second. So I want you to compare the Hispanic population with the rest of the state. Why are there 2 bulges in that distribution? That top bulge is me. That's me right there. Okay, I'm a baby boomer. The front edge of that cohort is now retiring. And why is my phone ringing off the hook? Private sector employers. Because baby boomers are going away and they are struggling to find workers of various skills levels. If you see the other the other bulge down there, that's the children of the baby boomers. And why do we have those indentations there between the 2 bulges? Those are our 20-somethings leaving the state. Now, the good faith estimate for years is that half of our high school and college graduates leave the state, but we believe that's probably a little bit high now. And but even at UNI, we're roughly 88% of our kids actually come from Iowa. We still lose about 30% of them to other states after they graduate, roughly. Those are rough terms. They're particularly disloyal at Iowa State, by the way. Craig, I want this on the record. They lose more than half of their graduates to other states, which is why we should give disproportionate funding, because more of our kids are loyal to this state. Thank you. You go to Mexico and say, do you guys like to be called Hispanic or Latino? And they'll look at you like, what do either of those mean? Those are terms that we use. They're finishing school. They're going to UNI. And they're putting off marriage at a much later age. And they're having that first child at a much later age. And every person in the room knows that later you put off that first birth, statistically you have fewer children. And it all dropped within about, I've seen some stats, some models that, the fertility rate was 6 or 7 live births. It's down now to less than 3. There was a fascinating thing. I did not bring it with me. There was a fascinating report that came out of the Pew Hispanic Center actually last week that they surveyed Mexicans living in the United States, are the descendants of Mexicans living in the United States. And it's very interesting. Fewer of them actually had friends and family here. So in other words, they were going home in part to be with their family and friends. But you always got to remember, there's always that ratio, risk to reward. And right now the risks are higher than the rewards. So that explains, at least in part, that the reverse flow. The other thing I want to say about this, right now the median age difference is about 15 years. That's significant, actually. And I think, and I've been doing this for 30 years now, I think a lot of the issues that we saw in towns that had Latino booms, a lot of people said it was about the culture, it was about the language. A lot of people said, it's about education. But I will tell you, I think a lot of the fundamental issues just had to do with the fact that the established resident population was a lot older than the new Hispanic population. And a lot of it was just generational. And as you all know, and I know you've all been paying attention, in this town, the last 15 years or so, all in all, things have actually gone pretty darn well. The naysayers were wrong. They were wrong. But did we have issues? Sure. Do we have problems? Of course. Do we have growing pains? Absolutely. A lot of people still have hard feelings about it? Sure. Right? But all in all, in Marshalltown and elsewhere, things have actually gone pretty darn well. And again, those kids are very loyal to Iowa. They're, like I said, they're English dominant. They're just as American as my kids. So again, I want to caution you when you look at population projections. These are the most recent projections out of Woods and Pools Economics. Again, this is for that, using the umbrella term Hispanic Latino for the state of Iowa, that given their current modeling in 2040, there'll be 420,000 Hispanics in the state, or about 13% of the state's total population. That is going to be wrong. That's going to be way too high because of this reversal, lower fertility rates. Now, here's why you got to be very cautious with population projections. Different models use different kinds of data, but they all have 4 things in them. How many people are born, how many people die, how long people live, and the 4th is migration or mobility. And that is the thing over which we have absolutely no control. We just guess. You take all of these are based on current assumptions. So these were actually, and another thing, a lot of these are based on data that's 4 or 5 years old. This is Woods and Pool Economics, but there are others that came up with roughly the same projection. These are mid-range projections. So you could have a high and a low, and these are mid-range. So it's kind of that one in the middle. But it's a great question. But again, I always caution you on these because you have no idea what's going to happen with migration. Immigration reform happens. Is this going to be right? Is it going to be low? No one really predicted the intensity of that reverse flow back to Mexico. I didn't. I actually, if you come to me 5 or 6, 7 years ago and say, Mark, what is Iowa going to look like today? I would have been wrong. I'll tell you why in a minute, okay? But this is part of it. So I would take these with caution. Now, given the same assumptions, though, you will appreciate this. By 2040, top 20 counties in Iowa in terms of the percentage of the county's total population that's Latino or Hispanic. And there you are. Again, you're going to be number 2. But I don't think you're going to hit 46% Hispanic. I don't. I think Crawford County will. Actually, Denison is Crawford County. I've been to Denison. It's fascinating. That town is already half Hispanic. But I don't believe that, and I think I do believe Crawford County will be half Hispanic. I do. And it's not going to be 2040. A couple of these other towns, I think these counties are going to be dead on. Marshall County, I think that's going to shoot too high. It's probably going to be around a third. 40% maybe. Again, it's very, very difficult to tell. We're just, a lot of it is frankly guesswork. Just what are your assumptions, what's the current data you have available, and you project it out. But notice that almost all of these in the top 10 are meatpacking communities or value-added agriculture. The one that throws people off is number 10, Polk County. Now, again, based on these assumptions, we'll be half Hispanic. A quarter Hispanic. I don't think that's going to happen either. Again, for a lot of reasons that we've been discussing here. There was a time when I believed that, but I don't anymore. I don't see Polk County being a quarter Hispanic. There are communities in Polk County that are going to get close. Alameda, but I would even be cautious about that because the Latino population in Postville has had a bit of a rebound since the raid, but they're mostly Guatemalans. And actually, there are more Somalis in Postville now than Guatemalans. Somalis are the big new group there. The Jewish population is less than half than what it used to be after the raid. And it's interesting too. I was up there, a few weeks ago. The Jewish population is a little more diverse than it used to be. They're not all in Chabad. There are a couple of other sects there that are kind of interesting. Because, you know, there's a different owner of the plant, and it wasn't, and the guy who owns the plant now is not in Chabad. And so he's opened it up to other folks from other sects. So it's smaller, it's doing okay. And they still have yeshiva there for but it's smaller too. You know, so they're still there, and you have Muslim Somalis and Jewish people, and the little mosque is actually in a building owned and rented out by my Jewish friend. I mean, it's, you know, I have a great job. It's just a lot of fun. So anyway, I would take these with, you know, some caution. Some of them I think are going to be pretty right on. Some of them are going to shoot too high. Some of them are going to shoot too low. One other thing I want to point out about this is if you look at the strict terms of the census, there are legal definitions for inclusion in a racial category. Yeah, you may or may not have seen them, but there are actually legal definitions for being white and being black or African American. One thing that, again, it sounds really nitpicky, but indigenous people from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, they are technically not Hispanic. They're American Indian by the strict terms of the census. But in practice, we call them Hispanic. And I say this because places like Sioux County, which, you know, is, you know, still, if you ain't much, if you ain't Dutch, that kind of, I mean, it's still very much proud of its old heritage. There are hundreds of Guatemalans who moved there, milking cows. And of course, the school system, and again, this is not a criticism whatsoever, the school system counts as Hispanic, but again, if you go back strictly at the terms of the census, they're American Indian. Again, splitting hairs. All right. Now, projected size of the black African American population. The reason that I share this is not just because our African American population in the state is growing to some degree, but really, as I'll share with you, and I promise I'll answer your question, we have become a major magnet state for African refugees. You have a bunch of them here. You have even more in places like Des Moines, Storm Lake, Sioux City. And remember that the black/African American census category includes African Americans whose families have been here for centuries, but it also includes Africans who got off the airplane last year, African refugees who got off the airplane last year. They put them all together. Culturally, they have nothing in common, right? And you have tremendous diversity within that African population as well. So I think this one is actually probably going to be pretty close. The Asian population, this one's already wrong because of folks from Burma. I'll come back to them. In other words, this number is going to go way up. So again, we're guessing here. Native American, American Indian population is going to remain relatively small. But one thing I always want to point out about Native American population in this part of the world is it's extraordinarily diverse. And even though we're familiar with the Meskwaki, you know, I think there are 800 to 900 people actually live on the settlement. You know, you have another rough terms, 1,000 to 1,200 those folks in the tribe, in that community who don't live on the settlement and so forth. But if you go look across the state, particularly out on the West Coast in the Siouxland, they are extraordinarily diverse in terms of tribal enrollments, tribal affiliations, tribal eligibility. I work with Department of Human Services out there. Their native unit works with kids that have some possible combination of 50 different tribes. So they're extraordinarily diverse. So even though, again, as a state, that number is relatively small, you know, it's actually a very, very diverse population. How quickly things can change. I did a lot of work on some of the preschool programs in the state a few years ago. And if you look at this pie chart on the left, this is the babies in the state of Iowa. So the birth through 4. Okay, these are the preschoolers, the pre-K kids. And I want you to notice that in 2000, 89% of all those kids in the state were white. But if you look down the road here, 13 years later, it was gone from 89% to 80%. And that, again, is for the state. So you do see this diversification. You know, so what's happened is those are the kids coming down the road. I did a speech for the community college trustees last week, I think it was last week. I said, here they come. Here's who's coming. Okay, and these kids will be in your schools, you know, actually relatively soon. And to put a local spin on it, this was Marshall County in 2012. This is, again, the babies, just the babies alone, birth through 4. This is 2012 estimates, but you can see 56% of the babies were white, 38% Hispanic, 3% black, 2% Asian. Now, if I had the data available to do this for, say, last year, then that slice would be even smaller. I do get the question, what about folks 2 or more races? That's not reflected in this particular data because this is some of the estimate data. But as I'll share with you here in a minute, the schools for the last 2 to 3 years now are required to count kids within a category of 2 or more races if that is what their parents designate. So that's the big Latino boom. So for 15 years or so, 90% of what I did had to do with Hispanics. You know, there are a handful of other groups coming in, Vietnamese, some Thai Dam, the Bosnians, but 90% of what I did was about the big Latino boom, which again was predominantly Mexican. But then things started to change, and I know it's going to sound kind of silly, but I started getting phone calls from school superintendents, sheriffs, and others saying, Mark, we have these 2 kids that just enrolled in school, and we can't communicate with their parents. And I say, who are they from? Well, we think they're from accountants. I think what language do they speak? We can't quite tell. We can't quite figure it out. And I literally started getting these phone calls because what happened, to make a very long story short, is that we started to see the growing presence of many smaller ethnically and linguistically diverse populations. And we started to go, and so you got to time this out with that reversal of the Mexican population. So they stopped coming. In some cases, they started going home. And then you started to see what the new folks that came into the communities were extraordinarily diverse. And you saw that here too. Folks from Sudan, you see the population of Burma, we'll talk about them in just a minute. And I'll tell you why. But that's basically, as that reversal, the Hispanic reversal started to take place, who were the newcomers that came into our communities? And we call this micro-plurality. I'll give you examples in just a minute. And this is what really changed my career, frankly, is that, again, the Hispanic, I thought, you came to me 5 or 6 years ago and say, what's Iowa going to be like? And Mark, what are you going to be doing in 2016? At that time, I would have told you I was going to continue to work on Latino issues. And that's what the phone calls were going to be all about. I was wrong. I admit it. And now we have this micro-diversity, and that's what's really driving everything that I do. And again, I'll explain why this has happened. I've already given you some hints about why it happened, but that really changed what I do. Latinos are kind of old news, all due respect. Been there, done that. They've been here long enough. Imagine, some of you, of course, remember Marshalltown before the boom, but I can't. This is the Marshalltown that I've known and loved for 20 years. And, like the Storm Lakes of the world, been there, done that. But now things have changed, and we have new challenges. And we have what we call, Michelle and I call it micro-plurality. Some of our colleagues call it super diversity. And what happened is, this is a partial list, and here we go, I'll answer your questions now. Who's coming? Smaller numbers. None of them are coming in critical mass. And I know it sounds really nitpicky, but we've had thousands of people come from Burma, but they're not Burmese refugees, they're refugees from Burma. I know it sounds nitpicky, but most of them are not ethnic Burmese. So you have here Karen, Karini, Chin, Hakka Chin. The Embark good faith estimate today is that there are about 7,000 refugees from Burma in the state today. They've all arrived in the last 3 years or so. And in the state of Iowa, they speak at least 24 different languages. We have about 1,200 or 1,300 in Waterloo, Cedar Falls, mostly Waterloo. They speak 9 different languages. So I'll make this clear, there's diversity within diversity. So what we want to do as human beings is simplify things. The Burmese refugees are here. That doesn't tell me a lot. The refugees from Burma are here, and then I need to know their ethnicity, their tribal affiliation, their primary language that they're speaking at home. I also want to know, by the way, what refugee camp they came from. Because if you have folks who came from Thailand, they got a better head start than those who came from Malaysia, for example. They got better health care in Thailand than they did in Malaysia. So you're going to see those differences as well. So one thing that I really drive home with service providers, and I did this, where was I yesterday? I can't remember. I just said, you've got to start tracking this stuff. You can't just say, they're Asian. That means nothing. Oh, they're African. That means nothing. I need detail. Get detail, because that's what's going to start mattering. So, lots of Africans, and lots of Africans. And I want to make something clear. For the folks from Burma, most of the Africans, the glory days of refugee resettlement into the state are long gone. Some of you remember back in the day, you may have belonged to a parish or a church or a mosque or a synagogue, and they said, okay, we're going to pool our resources and we're going to sponsor a refugee family. And a bunch of you did that, and God bless you. And you met them at the Des Moines airport, you took them under your wing, you helped them get jobs and housing, and you helped them learn English, and you helped the kids integrate. And we were doing it right. You were doing it right, the federal government was doing it right, our own Bureau of Refugee Services was doing it right, and Iowa has a very, very proud history of resettling refugees. Those days are long gone. And most of the refugees from anywhere in the world who come to Iowa today are not resettled here initially. They're resettled someplace else in the country, and then they secondarily migrate here. So they're backfilling, basically, in many respects, for the loss of Latinos. So they are not being resettled here. Two of them are actually resettled directly in Iowa. The first Burmese that came to water were directly recruited by the local meatpacking plant. Then they got on the phone with each other, and within weeks of being flown into Dallas or Indianapolis or something, they were secondarily migrating to Waterloo and then other parts of the state. Same thing for the Africans. Most of the African refugees in the state are what we call secondary migrants. Iowa may be their second, third, fourth destination. But we have the second largest concentration of Sudanese people in the world outside of Sudan in Des Moines. And it's extraordinarily diverse. I met yesterday afternoon with some folks from the West African community, and they started rattling off all the places. So where, because I do this from time to time, so who's here, who's coming? They started rattling off countries, and I couldn't keep up. And they're coming in growing numbers. So we just had 300 people from the Congo move to Waterloo about a year ago, more or less. During the Ebola scare, we had public health officials who didn't believe that Liberians and Sierra Leoneans lived here. Michelle and I had to point out how wrong they were. 5,000 West Africans live in Iowa alone, probably more now. So we have lots of Africans here. Smaller, interesting groups, Ukrainian Pentecostals in Sheraton. Does anybody know where Sheraton is? It's south of Des Moines. Beautiful little community, Lucas County. Beautiful, and they have about, probably 800 to 900 Ukrainian Pentecostals. Fascinating people. They're refugees from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I've met with these folks, and all the locals think they're Russian. They're not. The Ukrainians hate the Russians, and they pointed that out to me. And they said, what are you doing here? Why are you in Sheraton? And you know what they said? They said, the countryside reminds us of home. They have a very close relationship with the Amish. They get all their food from the Amish. And basically, you know what they said? They said, people here leave us alone to practice our religion. They leave us alone to be good Pentecostals. They just leave us alone, basically. And that's why they're there. They have big families, and they drive all the school sports coaches nuts because none of them play sports. Said, you got these big boys, why aren't they playing football? These girls should be playing volleyball. And we have to explain to them that they can't stay after school and play basketball because they have to go home and take care of a little sister. These are what we call high context families. Lots of these populations are popping up all over the place. I run into people in professional and personal capacities. Oh yeah, we have some of those folks in my town. I go, what? And so you started to see all of these folks. Now, in terms of the Western Pacific, Marshall Islands, Yap, Chuk, Truk, Micronesia, Palau, lots of these island nations, okay? They're popping up in small and larger numbers around the state. We have about 300 people from Micronesia living in Storm Lake right now. Most of them are from an island on which the only people in the world speak that particular language, called Pompeian. So we have all of these little populations, and what on earth drove the fact that you have 54 languages in your high school now? This is micro-plurality, micro-diversity. African Americans coming from Chicago. We're going to have more Iraqi refugees coming to Des Moines. Are we going to have lots of Syrian refugees coming to Iowa in the near future? No. Down the road, who knows? I don't think so. But we have lots of Iraqis who are actually coming now. Iowa has become a magnet state for a lot of these folks. I love it when people anticipate. What do all these people have in common? They're all eligible to work in the United States. Most of them are refugees, so when they get off the airplane, they're eligible for permanent residency status. African Americans from Chicago are citizens. And the people from Palau, those are former American territories. But under treaties, they're all sovereign nations now, but under a treaty with this country, they can live and work anywhere they want. And sometimes they are being recruited. Not always. So, and the other thing about the Marshall Islands, again, people can yell at me all they want about climate change. The Marshall Islands are sinking. So we have people from the Marshall Islands in Iowa today who are literally climate change refugees, and there are going to be more of them coming. Things are going to change very quickly. That's what happened. These are the folks who have now come into our communities as the new arrivals of Mexicans has dropped off precipitously. And you have lower fertility rates. So the challenge then, of course, is this microplurality. When you go from 2 or 3 languages, and I should go back to this, by the way, people used to yell and scream at me. When the Latinos came, I always thought it was funny how people yelled at me at the Morning Optimist Club and scream at me about, whether or not the Latino workers are legal or illegal. And they always said, what we need is a legal workforce. Well, you got it. But instead of having 2 languages, you've got 180 now in Iowa. That's our good faith estimate. We're up to 180 languages in the state. Some people suggest we're low. So you start to see this tremendous diversification. If you look at English language learner enrollments, this is for the state. In 94, 95, across the state, there are only 5,400. But if you look here, 10 years later, it's up to 28,000. And that number is actually low because you can only count those kids for like 3 years. And they're still learning English, but you can only count them for that little bump in funding for just about that 3-year period. You, of course, have experienced this here. I know this is hard to see, but this is minority enrollment in Iowa schools. You look at the school year 2000, 2001, you had 9 white students, 46,000 or 9.7% of all the kids in the state. 15 years later, it's up to 21.8%. So not quite a quarter of all the kids enrolled in Iowa schools are non-white, they're minority. That's 15 years. That's nothing. That's very quick. You look at it graphically, go back to 2006, 2000, 2001, again, 9.7, it's up to 21.8. And of course, that's across the state. But if you have towns like yours, it's way above 21%, way above that. English language learners used to be 2.3% of total enrollments. Now it's up to 5.7%. Again, that's across the state. One thing that I've been doing for some school districts with multiple buildings, like Des Moines, is looking at the statistical relationship among English language learner status, minority status, and eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. It's fascinating. Those curves are right there. So it's absolutely amazing. So another thing that's kind of changed because of this micro-diversity is the top 5 languages have shifted. Spanish has been #1 for quite some time, of course, because of the boom. Vietnamese has kind of snuck up with it. Right now, the 3rd most spoken language among English language learners in Iowa schools is Arabic. Arabic. So followed by Bosniak, which used to be like number 2 or 3. And some of your folks, Karen languages, but there are several of them, so they lumped them together.
So what countries would be from speaking the Arabic languages?
That's kind of depend on the community. There could be Iraqis. They speak Arabic. Could be Saudis. We have about 500 Saudis in Cedar Falls right now. Most of them are students. Their kids would count. It really depends. Millions of people around the world speak Arabic. They don't all speak the same Arabic, right?
But it could be Saudis, it could be Yemenites, Yemenis, it could be people from even Syria, not that many, yeah, maybe from Lebanon, Egypt. We have an enclave of Egyptian Arabic speakers down in southeast Iowa. They're building that $1 billion fertilizer plant. Those are Egyptians, they speak Arabic. A lot of them may too be the children of people who come here with highly skilled individuals like doctors, engineers, and so forth. Could be others, could be students. So, you know, what's keeping me busy? Language. There are languages coming to the state I've never heard of. There are languages coming to the state that are relatively rare. Finding interpreters has become a very difficult challenge. We are an under-resourced state, period. And then we come to these languages, and I'm literally having phone conversations. I train all the state troopers in the state about how to work with these populations, and I will they all have my cell phone number. They call me. You know, the cars are whizzing by, and they'll say, Dr. Gray, would you listen to this? And they'll put the phone up to the person and say something. And they say, did you get that? Can you tell me what language that is so I can get the right interpreter? If you can find in-person interpreters and they're good and they're ethical, you keep them, flowers and chocolates every day if you can find them, and you trust them. Just because someone's bilingual doesn't make them an interpreter. Make that very clear. Some of the worst interpreters are bilingual. Make that very clear. We have a lot of problems with unethical interpreters. Lots of problems. And if you can find an interpreter on the telephone, I didn't bring it in, but I'm a licensed first responder, and I do all this training with cops. And like, I just did a big training for Marshalltown police here about a month ago, 2 months ago. How you use a telephonic interpreter. How do you effectively use it? I have some tools. Again, I didn't have time to bring them in, but I carry in my own vehicle these tools where I can hand a handset to somebody and put an interpreter on my cell phone. But the problem is, even those available interpretation services can't cover all the languages that we're seeing today. We're just simply not keeping up. Hang on there just 1 second. So what do you do? When the Latinos arrived, and there was a critical mass of those folks, it made perfect sense for your school district to get hire bilingual aides, bilingual teachers, the two-way Spanish-English program out at Woodbury, a model for the nation. People from all around were getting on the waiting list. Great stuff, critical mass. April's coming towards me to tell me to, yeah, I always know that look, that walk. Next thing she's gonna go like this. I'm almost done, April. So, it makes sense. You had critical mass, you expend the resources for Spanish speakers. What do you do with 54 languages? You can't keep up. No one, and by the way, no one is keeping up. We're all struggling with this. We're an under-resourced state as it is. And then we have other challenges. So language, direct communication. But I gotta tell you, Dr. Dublin and I could work on literacy issues every day. Even among English speakers, literacy has dropped like a rock. I have kids coming to me at UNI who cannot graph out a sentence. I love them, I respect them, they like me. I have kids, this is wonderful, actually thank me, I do a lecture, that's cool. I love that. But they can't read and write. They can't read, they hate reading books. Literacy, big problem. Numeracy, simple math. Remember how you learn math is cultural. And symbols, everybody thinks, well, we can use symbols to communicate. Well, not always, because not all symbols are universal. And I want to give you just a perfect example. You see that symbol up in the upper left-hand corner? This is a good faith effort where the word is in English and then it's translated into Nuer. But we've had Nuer speakers, they say, here's what needs to happen, and they show them this symbol, and they look at that, and it reminds them of the genocide back home, and they're running out the door because they said, you're going to kill me? You have to be very careful. This stuff, you know, all of our assumptions have to go. And my other one too is, why does she have a turtle in her stomach? You know, I always thought that was cute. But the last thing I want to share with you, so I'm almost done, April. I'm down to 2 slides. Okay. I know that march. I know the look. Okay. I just want to, you know, and how do you make all this work? I mean, why has a guy like me done this 7 times in the last 11 days? Okay, various audiences, various kinds of presentations and trainings. The bottom line is, you know, how is it that we understand our own cultural experience? how do other people come in with their own cultural experience, and how your expectations different. And again, this is one of the simple tools that we use. I won't go through all this, but you know the stuff that you see in a culture, that's not culture, that's the easy stuff. The clothing, the food, that's fun, I love it. You know, Maria's gonna wear her traditional dress to Mass on Sunday. That's great, I respect that. I think that's cool, I love that stuff too. That's not the hard part. You know, having people, all the kids and their parents bring stuff for potlucks, that's great, that's not culture. That's the easy stuff. If we can handle all of our issues by having potlucks, they're fun and I love them and I really expect that. But this is the hard work. This is the stuff that wrecks our ships. And again, I have a much more intricate one of these. I mean, how do you understand each other's rituals and tattoos? Taboos. Forgive me, tattoos too, but taboos. This is hard work, I'm not gonna lie to you. It takes time, it takes patience. We get really good with some folks and somebody else comes along. I got clients who get really good with one population, some other population comes along and they're starting from scratch. Why don't those people act and think like those people? Because they're not. They're not going to. Where do your expectations come from? From your cultural experience. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Don't ever apologize for that, but understand that their expectations might be different. Again, this is just one little way to get the conversation started. I did a training for 125 social service providers the other day. Big, massive room full of people. And I showed them this one and the longer version. And you can talk all day just about communication style. Body spacing, eye contact, touching, what's appropriate. Where you get to some of these other things like silence. Rural Iowans tend to love silence. They don't like to talk in front of groups, and immigrants or refugees come here and they find us cold. And they'll ask me, why don't they talk? I said, that's rural Iowa culture, and I don't have time to go into that. I can explain it. There are reasons why rural Iowans tend to be quiet. And then they come to my classroom and they're really quiet, right? So that, again, this is just a tool. You can find some of the projections from the Census Bureau, but I would use that very cautiously. I'm almost done, April. I would go to census.gov and they'll have some projections. There's also a state data center at the State Library of Iowa. It's a really good source. They have not all this stuff. But I'll tell you what you're not going to find. You are not going to find the data about the micropopulations. It doesn't exist. It does not exist. It exists. You get to see this at all because I travel the state. We could talk about, how does human culture work? I mean, that's a whole nother lecture. And how do you work these things out? I can explain rural Iowa culture versus cultures from, we could do that too. So, anyway, Craig, hope you're not running out of tape, pal. April, thank you for arranging this. Thank you all for your kind invitation. God bless you. I'm going to go drive past the red-winged blackbirds now. It makes me very happy because spring is here. I always feel like spring is here when the red-winged blackbirds arrive. And they got to Cedar Falls yesterday. So thank you very much. Cheers.